Hi everyone and welcome. Welcome to this a taster webinar on People's Productivity Matters. Delighted to see some old friends rejoining and glad to have some new friends joining us. And if you're watching this on playback, welcome. Glad that you've caught up with us and look forward to hearing your comments in due course. I'm Clinton Wingrove from Clinton HR. We're the productivity people. I've invested decades of my life working in the field of productivity, helping managers and individual contributors realize their potential and transform their performance. And there's never been a period when this is actually more important than it is now. What we're going to look at today is what is productivity. It's a word that's frequently bandied around, but our experience tells us that many organizations have not thought through seriously what it actually means, why it matters, and how you measure it. We're also going to look at what we now know about productivity and particularly people's productivity, and what are the pros and cons of attempting to increase it in these days when everybody's anxious about the effects that changing work patterns, etc., may have. And lastly, we're going to look at what we call the productivity equation. We often think in terms of productivity as being primarily about motivation, but actually we're going to share with you that there's a number of different factors that dramatically impact the whole productivity of individuals and of teams. So is productivity an issue in your organization? Let's see some yeses in the chat box. Presumably it is, as you've joined us today for the session. Yes, a yes, to be sure. Excellent. Of course, productivity should be a concern. What we now know is that this is something that's going to become more and more important as we go forward. It matters for many reasons, but these are some of the primary ones. Investors expect it. And across the globe now, questions are being asked around where do we invest? Which country do we invest? Social changes, political changes, military changes are raising questions about who invests where and why. It ensures that an organization is sustainable. All organizations focus on the issue of growth. You remember, if you don't grow, then you're going backwards. But in order to be sustainable, we need to achieve the levels of productivity. We can't just grow by throwing effort at things. And it creates and supports that growth. It creates higher levels of engagement. We often think in terms of engagement being the driver of productivity, but actually there's a reverse correlation as well. That as you increase productivity, engagement increases. If you can tap into that self-fulfilling circle, things improve dramatically. And it increases and encourages and creates opportunities for creativity. More and more organizations are looking to differentiate themselves from competitors, differentiate themselves from other employers. What we now know is that the further you increase productivity, the more likely you are to create those environments where people are more innovative. So the question then is, what do we mean by productivity? And very often we think purely in terms of widgets per minute or output per hour, stemming very much from research that was done in the 50s and 60s. And of course, manufacturing productivity is an issue. Have we got efficient equipment, etc.? But what we're looking at today is people's productivity. And we still use the same basic construct that productivity has got to be something related to the amount of valuable output that you're achieving versus the units of resource that you've used. So the question is, what do we mean by values of units of valuable output? And of course, it can be products. And particularly if you're a highly geared manufacturing operation, the number of products produced is significant. But it can also be services. This can apply to organizations in the financial services sector, in the healthcare sector, even in the hospitality sector. How do you measure the valuable output? But what we realize is that there are actually universal measures that you can actually use. And typically we work with organizations looking at revenue or profit, and typically profit is a more meaningful figure. What's the net profit that's being produced? And perhaps in some organizations where they're not yet in that situation, they may even be looking at the milestones met, having metrics around progress towards some strategic plan. And then the question is, what do we mean by resource used? And of course, money is a key factor, and so are materials, and so is time. But if we're looking at people's productivity, how do we combine those? So one of the things we often look at, which makes the figures variable and comparable across organizations, is what's the organization's net profit as a percentage of the total HR cost. And that total HR cost is payroll, benefits, bonuses, computer systems in HR, time invested in performance reviews and appraisals, recruitment costs, etc. So what are the total costs of having people? And by doing this, we actually achieve for commercial organizations a figure that's comparable across organizations. What's the net profit for total HR cost? This is also something that you can compare period on period as well. So this figure gives us a good measure of people's productivity. And one of the questions I like to ask clients or potential clients is, do you know how much lost productivity in your organization actually costs? And what I'm going to share with you is a calculation that looks at that cost just from the perspective of low engagement or motivation. Because frequently when we talk to people about productivity, it's motivation that's the real center of their interest. And as I said earlier, we're going to come and look at 3 other factors that we should take into account. But let's just focus on the one that normally jumps up people's agenda. So let's actually look at the issue of engagement. And on the screen, I've shared some fairly traditional, fairly commonly accepted definitions of different levels of engagement. So fully engaged, these are people who are passionate about their work. They act like owners. They do what it takes. They step up. They role model. And you can spot these very easily in an organization. And then the category of engaged. These are the people who do what we pay them to do. So one would expect them to be reasonably productive. They deliver good, solid performance. They always do their fair share of their work, and they work well with others. But of course, as we know, that's not the real world, is it? All organizations have a significant number of people who are somewhat engaged. You frequently find them by the water cooler. You're never too sure what they're actually doing. They're a little bit selective about where they put their energy. They do what it takes, but they do what it takes to get by, and often are reluctant to get involved in new things or step up and learn new skills. And of course, we all know in most organizations, we have some people in what we've called the disengaged category. These are ones nobody will ever admit to having recruited, and frequently people don't want them on their team. Yeah, they're the people who have a we versus they perspective. Their results are generally not meeting the standard. So let's assume, as I think is a reasonable assumption, that all organizations have a spread. So the question then is, how much does that cost? So let's take as an example an organization with 400 people. And again, it's simply an example. Let's imagine that organization has got an average salary of $27,500 per annum. So that includes all the people within the organization. And let's assume that the overhead costs for HR, the additional costs are 18%. So that covers all the things I described earlier. And that's probably a significant underestimate. So now let's imagine in an ideal world, we would actually have everybody in the engaged category, and their contribution versus the standard expected of them would be 100%. what we know from substantial research across most Western nations, that's not how the real world works. What actually is a typical spread is as follows. Typically in an organization, you'll have around 12% of your people fully engaged. That's a little bit more than 1 in 10. And for many organizations, that would actually be a goal. But it is, in general terms, not unreasonable. Typically about 50% then are actually producing what's expected of them. They're producing that to standard. They're not distracted. They come to work wherever that physically is, working from home or in the office or in some other premises, perhaps even out on the road. But 50% typically are hitting the 100%. So now we've got 62% producing standard or above. That leaves us with 38%. And typically they are spread 30% somewhat engaged and 8% questionable. Hence why many organizations invest in giving critical feedback, encouraging managers in how to manage performance. What we then see is, what's the contribution that those people are actually making? And typically that 12% are producing anything above around about 20%, on average 22% above what's expected. Now, let's be clear. This is not about being busy. This is contribution. This is value add. And your really fully engaged people produce substantially more per hour than your engaged people. So it's not just about business. It's about output. Typically, the somewhat engaged produce less than that. Some of the more recent research is showing that can be as low as 50%. In here, we've put it in as 75%. So these figures are cautious. The disengaged, the average reported indicates that the disengaged produce anything from 50 to 60% or lower. In fact, frequently your disengaged staff can have a negative contribution. They may actually do things, but their toxic behavior or their distractions, and we'll come back to that later, negatively impact productivity. So what we see is, compared to what we're paying for, the fully engaged in this example organization are producing nearly $250,000 a year that we're actually not paying them for. But what you'll notice is the somewhat engaged and the disengaged are having a significant negative impact. So the question then is, what can we do about that? And these figures are very typical of an average organization. So what we now see is we've now filled in the gray column, which is the number of employees out of that 400 who fall in each of the categories. How many of these could we move up to an engaged level? And what we now know is, with quality management, with excellence in leadership and management, it's relatively simple to make some moves. And what we want to look at is, what is it reasonable to see? And what we see here is a typical example. Relatively straightforward investment in looking at changing processes, management, feedback systems, etc. We can actually move out of that 200 who are engaged. It's reasonable to be able to move 40 of those into the fully engaged category. Out of the 120 somewhat engaged with good quality leadership and management, it's possible to move them out 60 of those up into the engaged category. It's the disengaged that are challenging. And out of the 30 odd, it's likely that you could only move around about 3 of those into the somewhat engaged category. But what you'll see on the right-hand end is the financial impact of that is quite substantial. If we actually sum that up, what we start to see is a very significant figure. In this example, minimal, basic focus on the way in which productivity is managed within the organization can see a 5.9% return on cumulative expense, totaling £768,000 per annum. And that's after allowing an investment in achieving that, an investment in communications and an investment in management training. So simply focusing on how do we increase productivity in an organization, focusing primarily on the dimension of motivation and engagement can have a significant financial impact. And I typically find that the CFO is often more interested in this than the CHRO. And if you'd like to have a copy of that spreadsheet so you can fill in the details for your organization, just put your email address in the chat box, or you can send us an email at clinton@clintonhr.com. We'll be happy to share that spreadsheet with you. It's very simple. You can enter the figures for your company and you can see the actual financial cost of just the motivation dimension of productivity can have within your organization. So what do we know about people's productivity? And you may be thinking, well, you know, we're pretty productive. People are working really hard. I hear a lot of stories about people being stressed and anxious, people working long hours. And that may be true. But what we know is the cost of low productivity, particularly in the Western world, is very significant. The Office of National Statistics showed figures that shows that people's productivity has been steadily decreasing on a 3-year moving average since 1986. And the UK is second to bottom in Europe and Scandinavia. Now, various other figures looking at manufacturing productivity put the UK higher, but that's a quite different issue. What we're looking at here is people's productivity. What we also know is that at the moment, organizations are very concerned about mental ill health and potential litigation against it. Perfectly valid, quite understandable, and organizations should be concerned about the well-being of their staff. Of course, those concerns are being raised as employment legislation continually increases those concerns, European legislation as well as UK legislation. But what we now know is that the apparent and the suspected correlation between encouraging people to be more productive and increased anxiety is not actually validated. That frequently the people who are more productive are less anxious than the people who are less productive. But despite that, Price's Law, which is something some of you may have come across, if you haven't, it's well worth looking up. Price's Law shows that in most organizations, on average, 50% of the valuable output is actually produced by the square root of the number of those involved. What does that mean? What it means is in an organization of 400 people, 20% of the people produce 50% of the valuable output. That correlates very closely with the figures we just looked at in the spreadsheet. So, rhetorical question for you. How many units have you got in your organization that are perhaps too large? There used to be a phrase that said small is beautiful. If you're going to manage productivity, you need to put your arms round the group. Smaller groups tend to be more productive than larger groups. As groups get larger and larger, productivity typically declines. That's also true in meetings, and we make some comments on meetings in a little while. So what are the cons of attempting to increase people's productivity? And clearly there are some. Employee burnout. But you'll notice I've been talking not about increasing busyness. I've been talking about increasing productivity. If you increase productivity and you do it well, the level of burnout can actually decrease. Yes, you can risk quality, but interestingly, people's attention levels and the number of mistakes they make actually can increase the less productive that they are. And one of the things we'll be looking at before we finish the webinar is the issue of disruptions. We now work in an incredibly noisy environment, and actually people who are less productive frequently are much more easily distracted, and that's where the quality goes. Of course, focusing on productivity can be quite a narrow focus, so we need to make sure we don't do it at the cost of losing sight of client satisfaction, employee satisfaction, etc. But in particular, what we must avoid is short-term gains over long-term success. Increasing productivity is a strategy. It's very rare that you can increase productivity with short-term tactical actions. And we're not looking here to erode work-life balance. Actually, if people can be more productive, work-life balance can actually increase. We can actually get to a point where people are working more efficiently and as a consequence can get more done in less time. And what we're not talking about here is micromanagement. And again, organizations that identify that productivity is an issue frequently look to implement micromanagement, far tighter controls, more metrics, etc. Now, whilst management using metrics is incredibly important, whilst we want managers closely aligned with their staff, micromanagement can actually reduce productivity. So some of the pros of attempting to increase productivity, though, are very significant. By definition, cost savings. Many organizations at the moment are looking to reduce costs. We've seen reductions in marketing. We've seen reductions coming through in packaging, raw materials. We're seeing reductions coming through in headcount. Increased productivity typically reduces overall costs, hence why we focus on a measure that reflects that directly. And as I said, our typical measure we like to look at is net profit as a percentage of total HR cost. But attempting to increase productivity can increase competitive advantage. You start getting people thinking more about what they're doing and why. What's the contribution I'm making in the next hour, in the next morning, in the next day? And typically that stimulates innovation. People start to think of better ways of doing things rather than simply trying to do them faster or trying to do more of them. So typically focusing on productivity effectively produces that higher level of innovation. It can also lead to improved accountability. People start to think more about what they're actually achieving during the execution of their tasks. And as a result, you frequently find that you have improved employee morale, which of course then links back to where we started, which is the issue of motivation. So again, thinking back to those costs, thinking back to, is it worth you investing? If you want a copy of that spreadsheet, put your email address in the chat box or email me, clinton@clintonhr.com. I'll send you a copy of that spreadsheet. For your organization, you can make a really good estimate, of what the cost is for just the motivation dimension within your organization on productivity. And you can look at what a reasonable investment would produce in terms of payback. So we talked about motivation. What is that? Motivation, it's around making sure that people understand the purpose. As Simon Sinek so beautifully puts it, people need to understand their why. It's around role clarity. One of the things we now know is that people want a number of things. Primarily, they want clarity. What is it you expect me to do and why, and how well do you think I'm doing it? They want assurance. They want assurance that their effort will be acknowledged. They want assurance that you've got their back. They want recognition. Research I did with Dr. Marciano when we wrote our book Super Teams identified that recognition is one of the primary drivers of respect in an organization, which is one of the characteristics of super teams or teams performing at their best. People look for recognition even if they tell you they don't. And then, as we said, respect. If every employee in your organization feels respected when they conclude their work each day, you're probably going to have a highly productive workforce. but how do you create that level of individual respect? And what we now know is the significant differentiator of sustainably successful organizations, those that are highly productive, those that get the best out of their people, the differentiator is their caliber of their leadership and management. And that means they attend to the things that really matter. And what we know is, and I said earlier, productivity isn't just about engagement and motivation. That clearly is a factor. You want employees who are engaged. You want employees who are motivated. But what we now know is that it's not that simple. And our research has identified this equation, that people's productivity, and I'm putting aside, for example, automation and computer systems. I'm talking about how do we get the best out of the people. People's productivity is a combination of opportunity times capability times motivation. Decrease any one of those and cumulatively the product decreases. So opportunity, capability and motivation. But the big thing that's come onto the arena over the last decade is disruption or distractions. So let's look at each of those. We've looked at motivation. What do we mean by opportunity? Of course, people need the opportunity to perform extremely well. That means they need to have the right equipment. They need to have automation where they can. And of course, organizations are throwing huge resources at looking at artificial intelligence, although much of that, I think, is more appropriately categorized as a distraction. We need to have really good processes. And frequently in organizations, we're not prepared to step back and say, do we need to modify our processes? Often we hang on to them. What we need to do is to remove the scar tissue of past mistakes, to quote one of the previous prime ministers in the UK. So what we need is to make sure we think about, are people getting the information they need? We're in a world now where there's an information overload. And that's the problem. People need the right information at the right time in the right format. We currently seem to have a mindset to flood people with information. We're creating huge, extensive libraries. We're hitting people with pings and dings from all sorts of systems. But as an organization, are you thinking about what's the information that people actually need to excel in their role? And how do we ensure that that's the information that gets to them in the right format and the right time? Of course, they need time. Are you in your organization equipping people to understand how to manage their time? Rhetorical question. What percentage of your time in your calendar is currently blocked for the next month? And how much of that did you block? And the reason I ask that, in many organizations where people's productivity is low, people's time is sucked from them by people inviting them to meetings which perhaps do not produce the quality of output that's going to improve the productivity equation. So think about, do people have the time that they need in order to be productive? Do they have the authority they need? Are we delegating well and giving people not only the tasks we want them to perform, but the authority to do that and the authority to take the actions that are necessary? Rhetorical question. Have you ever stayed in a hotel where the people on the reception desk actually have the authority to make you happy? For me, it's one of the differentiating factors between great hotels and less than great hotels. People have the authority to serve you. And then the environment itself. And a lot's been looked at recently because of hybrid working. Have we set people up to have the best possible environment in which to work? As employers, we're responsible for the working environment our people work in. And that extends to if they're working at home. Are we guiding them? Are we providing them advice? And are we equipping them to have the real opportunity to excel? And then lastly, empowerment. Are we empowering people to do the things that will increase the contribution that they make on a daily basis? So if we were working with you, these are some of the things we'd look at under opportunity. But then there's the issue of capability. And of course, we think about people having the job skills. But are you as an organization thinking about optimizing the leadership and the management skills that are needed? We frequently promote people into management because they excel at something other than management. And as a consequence, we end up taking an exceptional individual contributor, leaving a vacancy for someone to come in who's probably less skilled, and we move that exceptional individual contributor into a role where they underperform as a leader or manager. If you're looking at increasing people's productivity, increasing the capability of your leaders and managers is absolutely critical. And then thinking about the individual capabilities that people need. And some of these may not fall under the obvious individual skills that they need to complete their job. But what we know is each of these has a major impact on people's productivity, and particularly priority and time management, but also project and task management, critical thinking, being able to sort the wheat from the chaff, this bombarding of information hitting us. Are we equipping people to work out what data matters and what data doesn't? Are we equipping people with persuasion and negotiation skills? We are constantly being encouraged to do things by systems, by prompt messages, by technology, by our smartphones, by our peers, by our direct reports, by our relatives, by the people who work from home where we work from home. We need to equip people with the ability to manage those circumstances. And frequently that's something about teaching them how to manage their mindset. So we touched on motivation. We talked about opportunity. We've talked about capability. But here is the killer. And this is the one that reduces all of these. This is on the bottom of the equation. You can increase capability. You can increase opportunity. You can increase motivation. But if people are then distracted, you have major problems. And what we know is from some recent research, for example, US workers lose an average of 1 hour and 18 minutes a day simply due to distractions. My guess is that that figure is incredibly similar within the UK. In the US, that accounts for $650 billion annually off of the bottom line. It's estimated that 63% of people need a minimum of 10 minutes to regain their focus if they're distracted. Think about that. How often during the day are you distracted by email? How often do you check your email? How often do you check your Teams messages, your Zoom messages, your all of the other technology that you use, Slack, etc.? How often are you distracted? The vast majority of people, we now know, it runs into hundreds of occasions per day. Each of those occasions individually has the potential to reduce your productivity dramatically. You lose 10 to 15 minutes every time you're distracted if that's from a static position. And of course, if the multiple distractions are overlaying each other, it can mean you can spend an entire morning or an entire afternoon achieving virtually nothing. It's estimated that 15% of workers admit to losing 3 to 5 hours a day simply because they're distracted into checking messages, looking at channels, looking at meetings, etc. Just prior to COVID, a research study was done that indicated that in the US alone, there were 11 million business meetings a day prior to COVID. An HR Business Review article, I believe it was, said that 74% of those failed to achieve their objectives, if indeed they had any. Research that's been done subsequently shows that the figure could have gone up from 11 million meetings to over 25 million. One estimate said 29 million a day. and that the success rate has dropped from 74% to 77% not achieving their objectives. These are really serious issues related to productivity. And what we now know is there are major factors that are triggering these lacks of productivity. Other people, interactions, meetings in particular. And not only meetings, but levels of attention. Some research we've done shows that if people are in a physical meeting with 6 or more people, the probability is that at any one point in time, only 50% of them know what was just said. The rest are distracted by pings, dings, noisy things, even just thoughts in their own head. If you're on a virtual meeting, it's likely your attention level over time averages round about a third. 2/3 of the time, you'll be distracted, daydreaming, or physically distracted by other things. So these distractions are proving to be fundamental. And it's only relatively recent neuroscience research is showing that part of this is because of our mental design, the design of our brains. But part of it is because of the way we are designing organizations, our office layouts, our use of meetings, the number of people we invite to meetings, how we run those meetings, the technology we deploy, supposedly to increase the sharing of information and the engagement of people, the way in which we manage people, the way in which we interact with them and disturb their concentration. Our ability to do focused work in many organizations is reducing at an alarming rate. So I challenge you, think about productivity in your organization. Don't focus just on the issue of motivation. Motivation is key, and it's something you can work on relatively easily. And as I said, you can typically increase your return on people's productivity by anything up to 4 to 6%. Think about capability. Think about equipping people with the skills that they need to interact with the world around them, interact with the systems and the technology we're using, interact with the people with whom they actually work. Think about opportunity. Think about how you design your layouts, your working methodologies, the way in which you schedule meetings and how you pull people into them or out of them to create opportunities for people to be productive. Think about the disruptions. Think about all these things which are actually triggering us in our brains to lose our attention, to lose our focus, and to therefore decrease our productivity. So what I challenge you to do is think about those things. As I say, if you're interested in the spreadsheet, put your email address in the chat box or email me, clinton@clintonhr.com, and we'll send you a copy of that spreadsheet for you to review your own cost of engagement. If you'd like to discuss the situation wider, if you'd like to talk to us about the productivity equation, we're happy to engage with you. No obligations, just have a chat, talk about how it relates to you and the things you might think about improving, whether or not you want to engage us to do that. And if you want to have that conversation, you can book a meeting with us. I've put the QR code up on the screen. I've put the hyperlink on the screen as well. So there we are. I don't see any questions in the chat box. We're just coming up to the end of the webinar. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with you today. I look forward to speaking to you, some of you in the future. And I hope that you go away thinking about not only how can I be more productive, but what can I do in my organization to apply that productivity equation, increase the motivation, yes, increase the capability, yes, increase the opportunities that people have to work more effectively, and to dramatically focus on reducing all those disruptions and distractions. So thank you, everybody. Pleasure to talk to you. Look forward to hearing from some of you in due course.